Hello, everybody, and welcome back for our last conversation of these just amazing couple of days. It has been just so fun, honestly, to share this space with you, to learn from you, to hear what you have to say, to lead you through some roll calls. It really feels like we have laughed together, cried together, talked about Mercury retrograde together, gotten ourselves registered and getting counted in the census. So it's just been phenomenal. I'm still holding William's voice and his words in my heart. I'm so grateful for the time to have connected with other folks. I'm sitting with the plenary sessions from yesterday and this morning that just brought so much heat, so much fire, and just really holding gratitude for the opportunity to come together as a community, to hear from my Congresswoman, and now to hear from EdTrust President and CEO, Dr. John King. Allow me to say just a few words about John before sharing a little bit about his bio, although I know all of us are big fans of you, John. So as I shared yesterday, I just completed my doctorate in education leadership at Harvard. I was the first in my family to go to college, certainly the first in my family to get in higher education here in this country. When I was doubting myself so much and thinking like, what are you thinking of applying to this program? Like you're not gonna get in, like that imposter syndrome voice that we constantly hear blocking us. A friend gave me the good advice of, hey, draw inspiration from somebody that you admire, and try to kind of think through your own path and your own dreams by seeing that it's possible. And I am not kidding. My person was John King. And I looked him up. Of course, I knew already a ton about him, but I was like, okay, let me just look into his life story. Let me see, like, what did he do and where did he go? And to read about a fellow Afro-Latino with roots very similar to me, with family stories and a neighborhood story, again, similar to mine, who'd gone back to Puerto Rico to support on the island and returned to New York City and led there, and then made it as education secretary for all of us across the country. I am so grateful for your existence. Thank you for being guide and light for me and so many others. I'm super excited to hear what you have to share with us today. And so to close us out, I'm pleased to introduce our closing plenary titled Reimagining the Social Contract of America. And so first, let me just share a little bit about him to make sure that we all have that shared understanding. So John B. King Jr. is the president and CEO of the Education Trust, a national nonprofit organization that seeks to identify and close opportunity and achievement gaps from preschool through college. He served in President Barack Obama's cabinet as the 10th U.S. Secretary of Education. In tapping him to lead the U.S. Department of Education, President Obama called King an exceptionally talented educator, citing his commitment to preparing every child for success and his lifelong dedication to education as a teacher, a principal, and leader of schools and school systems. Before becoming Education Secretary, John carried out the duties of the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Education, overseeing all policies and programs related to P-12 education, English learners, special education, and innovation. In this role, he also oversaw the agency's operations. In the department following his tenure as the first African American and Puerto Rican to serve as New York State Education Commissioner. He began his career in education as a high school social studies teacher in Puerto Rico and Boston, and as a middle school principal. So excited to cede the stage over to John. This is where I leave you all, at least from the stage. I will, of course, be listening. So thank you all for allowing me to serve in this capacity, and really, really hope we get to connect outside of this hop-in space. All right, everybody, here's John.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Marielle. And thank you for your inspiring leadership at EdTrust Massachusetts, but also your role in this amazing boot camp. So, there are many places to start, but one has to start this conversation acknowledging this moment that we're in and all the complexities of this moment. The fact that we have lost so many lives in this country to COVID-19, that COVID-19 has had a disparate impact on Black and Latino communities, on low-income communities all across the country. The fact moment we have failed as a country to respond adequately to the challenge of COVID, that it has impacted every aspect of our lives and our economy. We have to acknowledge that this is a moment of long overdue reckoning as a country with issues of systemic racism, with 400 plus years of anti-Blackness. We have to acknowledge this is a moment where we face a real economic crisis, where we have 14 million children who are food insecure, where we have 40 million Americans who are seeking unemployment as a result of the job loss due to the COVID-19 economic crisis. So this is a moment where many families are scared that they will be evicted from their homes if Congress does not step up with significant additional resources in the next stimulus. So this is a complex, challenging moment for the country, for all the states represented at this boot camp, and for all of us, for many of us personally who have seen friends, family members lost to COVID or struggling with the aftermath of COVID, all of us who each day worry about the impact that these multiple crises, these multiple pandemics have had on our friends, families, and communities. So I'm so grateful to everyone for taking time in this complicated moment to focus on the implications for education and to grapple with the reality that COVID-19 and the related economic crisis have in many ways put in sharper relief and exacerbated existing inequalities in our system. The reality that even before COVID, we gave the least to the students who need the most, that even before COVID, low-income students and students of color were less likely to be in high-quality early childhood education, less likely to have the strongest teachers, less likely to have access to advanced coursework, less likely to have access to counselors, less likely to get the support they needed in the transition to post-secondary education. And so we also have to see this moment as hopefully a wake-up call to the country, where we say, not just how do we get back to the status quo that existed before COVID, but how do we truly create a better, stronger, fairer, more just future? And that's what these conversations over the last 2 days have been about. Whether you're in a conversation about expanding access to quality early childhood, or a conversation about how we challenge the inequities in access to gifted and talented programs in 8th grade algebra and AP courses, or whether you were in a session thinking about resource equity and how we challenge the funding inequities that we experience in our school districts and in our schools. These sessions are really about how do we build a stronger, more resilient future. There are challenges that are immediate that we've got to take on together. I'm really proud that at EdTrust, we've broadened our lane in response to these crises. We have gotten involved in food security work and fought to ensure that the continuing resolution that Congress passed that's keeping the government open includes extending the pandemic EBT program that's getting dollars into the hands of families to address their food needs. I'm really proud that we have been engaged in the fight at the federal level and in states alongside all of you to address gaps in access to technology. We know, for example, that in San Antonio's largest district, there were 3,000 students who didn't even participate in remote learning in the spring. We know that at the start of the school year in Detroit, only 78% of students attended the first week of school, compared to 90% last school year. And that's in no small part because of gaps in access to devices and the internet. We know that there are places still today around the country where there are kids who are just missing no one's been in touch with them. No one's been able to connect with their family because they don't have internet access and adequate devices. We know there's some place right now where kids are sitting in a parking lot to do their homework. The other places where kids are sharing their mom's phone to do their work because they don't have devices. So we've stepped up to these immediate challenges alongside all of you, and we have to work to address them. We've got to address internet access. We've got to address device access. We've got to address food security. We've got to address instructional continuity and making sure that whether kids are fully remote or hybrid or in person, that they're getting actual high quality instruction. We know there are places that are paying too little attention to how much actual teaching time students are getting. Places in this country where kids go days without interacting with a teacher. We've got to challenge that. We've got to be responsive in this moment. But more than that, we've also got to take on these broader structural challenges. We've got to ask, how do we build a better future? And what are the systemic changes necessary for that? And I'm inspired, as I'm sure all of you are, by the young people who have stepped up to challenge police violence in this moment. I think about my daughters and going with them to the protests in DC and just being inspired, seeing them and other young people, multiracial community of young people, demanding an end to police violence, insisting that Black Lives Matter, demanding that we have justice for George Floyd and for Breonna Taylor and for Ahmaud Arbery. And inspired by them and heartened that they are staying with it, that we are months since the murder of George Floyd, and still young people are showing up, organizing, demanding something better. I draw inspiration from that and lessons for our work on education equity. I think we have to have that same intensity and tenacity and fight on education equity. And we've got to ask, what does it mean to say Black Lives Matter in an educational context? What does it mean to say Black and Brown lives matter in an educational context? What does it mean to say that our education system has to be anti-racist, that we have to dismantle systemic racism in all the ways it's expressed in our education system? One thing we know it means is that we've got to have equitable access to early childhood education. It can't be that some kids are enrolled in high quality public pre-K 3 and pre-K 4 and other kids aren't. And so we've got to address that. We've got to insist that states and the federal government put in the resources necessary to create quality early learning opportunities. And we've got to insist that they invest in the early learning workforce made up disproportionately of women of color. What does it mean to say Black and Brown lives matter when we think about our K-12 system? Well, it means we've got to close the funding gap, whether that's ensuring that we act on the Student Opportunity Act in Massachusetts, or that the legislature overrides the governor's veto of the Kerwin recommendations in Maryland, or that the litigation in Delaware is settled in a way that gets resources to the highest needs school districts. We've got to insist that we close that gap, that $1,800, $2,000 per student gap between the districts that serve the largest numbers of students of color and those that serve the fewest. We've got to close that gap because those resources translate into art and music, science and social studies, school counselors, post-secondary planning support. And so we've got to close that gap. When we say that Black Lives Matter, we have to mean that we're going to have discipline systems in our schools that emphasize restorative justice and care and concern and safety and support rather than excluding kids. And many of you were in the session on issues of discipline reform. But we know we've got more than 15 states that still have corporal punishment, that are using state-sanctioned violence against children. We know that Black girls are 5 times likely as white girls to be suspended from school. We know that in too many places, students of color are disproportionately referred to law enforcement over matters that should and could be resolved at school. So we've got to, if we're serious about the notion that Black Lives Matter and serious about making that a reality in schools, we've got to make sure that we invest in socio-emotional learning that is culturally responsive. We've got to make sure that we invest in counselors and mental health services. If we mean that Black Lives Matter in schools, we got to rethink our curriculum. We've got to make sure that Black and Latino students can see themselves reflected in the authors we read, in the stories that are told, in the texts that we study, in the history that we learn. The history we teach has to tell the true story of our history, the role of systemic racism in our history, and also give kids exposure to examples of Black excellence, Latino excellence, Asian American excellence, Native American excellence. Right? Our teaching and learning has to reflect our values around anti-racism. If we believe that Black Lives Matter, if we're committed to that principle, if we're committed to the idea that schools should be anti-racist institutions, then we need to diversify our teaching profession. It's unacceptable. The majority of our kids are kids of color, but only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. Only 2% of our teachers are African-American men. Unacceptable. We know what we can do to change that. We know we need to grow your own programs. We know we need to invest in minority serving institutions. We know that we need to provide more supportive environments for our teachers of color so they will stay. We can do that, but we have to follow through. We have to make sure that our approach to the teaching profession reflects our values. If we believe that Black Lives Matter, if we are committed to anti-racist institutions, then our post-secondary institutions, our higher ed institutions need to change. Some of you were in the session where we talked about our recent report, Segregation Forever, and the reality that in state after state, Black and Latino students are significantly underrepresented in public higher ed institutions, institutions that were created with an explicit mission of serving the people of their state, and yet they're not serving proportionate numbers of Black and Latino students. There are policy changes that we need, from overturning the ban on affirmative action in California, to intentional changes to how we do recruitment of students, admission of students, financial aid in our higher ed institutions, so that they are accessible to students of color, and so that when students of color get to those campuses, they have the supports they need to succeed and thrive, including our students who are undocumented, including our students who have been impacted by the criminal justice system. We need to carry our values around Black Lives Matter, our values around anti-racism, our values around a just society for all, regardless of race or income or zip code or the language that's spoken at home or immigration status. We have to carry those values into our education policies at every level. And I hope also in this moment, and I'll try to close on this note, I hope also in this moment that we bring this urgency around social justice, not just to education, not just to issues of police violence and criminal justice reform, but that we bring that same urgency to asking the broader structural question of how do we make a more fair, more just society? You all know, who've been with us at these events, that as a high school social studies teacher, I always look for historical parallels. Well, this to me is a New Deal moment. This is a moment like when we were emerging from the Great Depression, where FDR had the foresight to realize that it was important not just to get back to how things were before the Depression, but actually to put in place systems that would make our economy more resilient, that would make our safety net stronger, that would make our future more equitable and therefore more prosperous. And so that's where you get things like Social Security. Now, the policies of the New Deal were imperfect, and they weren't all designed in ways that protected Black and Latino workers and families. So it's not to say that the New Deal was perfect, but it is to say that idea, that notion that we should respond to crisis with a value set that says, how do we build something more just? That idea is exactly right. That is the tradition in which we should approach this moment. We should see this as a New Deal moment, and we should be asking, is it just that we've got 40 million Americans out of work and we've got the 40 wealthiest billionaires in the country, adding $500 billion to their net worth over the last 8 months. Is that fair? Is that right? Is that the kind of society we want to be? Is it fair that we have, as I said, 14 million kids who are food insecure? Is it fair that we have college students who are making the choice between whether or not to buy books or buy food or pay their rent? Is it fair that we have places around the country that are considering opening up the parking lots at community college campuses so that folks who are sleeping in their cars can have someplace safe to sleep? No, that's not fair. That's not just. That's not this kind of society we want to be. Is it fair that we are burdening our kids with all the consequences of climate change, from fires in California to hurricanes in the South and Southeast to flooding here in Maryland? No, that's not fair. That's not right. That's not just. We actually could build a more just future by creating good green jobs for folks, by helping young people understand the dimensions of the climate change problem and how they can tackle it. So this should be a transformative moment for our society. This should be a New Deal moment. This should be a moment from which we emerge stronger and fairer. And the only question is, are we prepared to have the political will to make that happen? And by being a part of these conversations over the last 2 days, you have made clear that you are committed to that. We at Ed Trust are committed to that. And we are committed to being in this work alongside you. And so as we come to a close, as we head towards November, we all got to vote. We all got to participate in electoral politics. But we've got to do more than that. We got to show up. No matter who wins the election, no matter what party wins any election around the country, it doesn't change our responsibility as advocates and activists to show up every time making the case for social justice, making the case for anti-racist policies, making the case for equity. So we got to show up at hearings. We got to keep publishing reports. We got to keep writing op-eds. We got to keep showing up at school board meetings and state legislative hearings, and stopping our legislator or school board member in the supermarket and telling them what they need to do to advance the cause of equity. We can't see voting as all we do. Voting is necessary, but not sufficient for social change. We've got to reflect the best traditions of protest movements in American history that have brought us to a more just place over time. And those best traditions require our full efforts, not just our vote, but our time, our willingness to organize, our willingness to network with friends and families and get them engaged. And I'm just grateful to be a part of that work alongside all of you. So inspired to be here, grateful for your commitment to this boot camp and your willingness to work as partners with us at Ed Trust, and look forward to seeing you hopefully in person at our next boot camp. Thanks so much and take care.